Hey everybody, welcome back this week as we continue our walk through the Westminster Shorter Catechism. This week we're on question 60, which asks, how is the Sabbath to be sanctified? The answer, the Sabbath is to be sanctified by a holy resting all that day, even from such worldly employments and recreations as are lawful on other days, and spending the whole time in the public and private exercises of God's worship, except so much as is to be taken up in the works of necessity and mercy. So the Sabbath is to be sanctified, set apart. It says here, by holy resting all that day, even from such worldly employments and recreations as are lawful on other days. So resting all that day. Now, resting is, as we talked about before, is not mean inactivity or physical rest. It also doesn't mean the difference between doing nothing versus doing something, or doing something sinful versus doing something holy. When we talk about the worldly employments and recreations, we're talking about those things that we do on the other 6 days of the week. Those things such as work or school, things like that, that one day we'll lay down. Those things that are not eternal. Those are the things we're being asked to set aside for this one day. And it says in this answer that we're to spending that whole time in public and private exercises of God's worship. So for 6 days, we get to do the worldly employments and recreations. We're doing these. We're supposed to do these. We're called to do these for God's glory during those 6 days of the week. But we are to set that one day of the week, or to set those things aside for a different kind of activity, which it says here, this whole time in public and private worship of the Lord our God. So how do we do that? And I think about some examples. You think public, we think is pretty easy, maybe just the worship service on Sunday mornings. But you also have Sunday school. You have maybe some Bible studies in the afternoon, different things like that. Some examples of private worship, talking to God, actually spending quality time talking to God in prayer, uh, praising Him, thanking Him, spending that actual time in prayer, reading His Word, meditating on His Word, discussing maybe discussing the message from the worship service that morning with somebody that was there, somebody that wasn't, or maybe a family member. Looking at that, trying to apply that message. How did that speak to you in a way that you can apply it? How was God's character revealed in that message to you? Those are some examples that we could look at. As far as public and private worship, there's others as well, but um, you may say, well, uh, in this answer we see this, but you may say that I can't. There's certain things I have to do. I can't just devote that time all day. We see that as an example. It says, "Except so much as to be taken up in the works of necessity and mercy." We see in Matthew 12, we see Jesus in a discussion with the Pharisees about what can or cannot be done on the Sabbath, and he's Jesus is speaking really to set the Pharisees straight and telling them that there are things such as the works of necessity and mercy that are okay on those days. Some examples I think about are think about the deacons or others that prepare the church in the mornings before worship, making sure the AC is on. I mean, um, or the ones Ryan or Patrick and those that set up the live stream. If you're out of town, you want to listen to the live stream. If somebody isn't working to do that, then you don't get it. It doesn't happen on its own, so somebody has to do it. And that's not to say for our minister. I mean, that's his day to perform. That's a hard day's work to be proclaiming God's word. That meditation beforehand, the preparing, the actual proclamation of the Lord. Um, the teachers that you have, the Sunday schools, the Bible studies we talked about, those are all acts of necessity or works of necessity that are required on days like that. The Sabbath is also not does not necessarily mean a day of fasting. So you need to eat. So somebody's got to prepare food, and generally speaking, you've got to clean up afterward. Um, so those are that's another example of necessity. An example of mercy I think of, you've probably heard this passage before, but in Matthew chapter 12, starting in verse 11, it says, this is Jesus speaking, which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Um, think about examples that you may see today. I mean, think of a doctor, for instance, who has to operate to save somebody's life. That's an act of mercy, a work of mercy that has to happen. Um, think of a fireman going out to a fire to rescue somebody. Our church is right down this road from a fire station. How many Sundays are you there that you hear fire truck, or outside after the worship service you see the fire truck coming down the road? Um, they're all performing acts of mercy. Those things that are um, proper for being done on the Sabbath. So there are exceptions, and God will bless those in those exceptions. But we must not forget that the Sabbath is the Lord's day. It's the one day of the week that we set aside for worship, the worship of the one and only true living God, our object of worship. Um, he is the one who gives us everything. I mean, he's given us life. He gives us everything. Um, so this week's answer, this week we see, is the Sabbath is to be sanctified by a holy resting all that day, even from such worldly employments and recreations as are lawful on other days, and spending the whole time in the public and private exercises of God's worship, except so much as to be taken up in the works of necessity and mercy.